Okay, so now we have 1914 to 1927. We say that's the Verona Band. 1965 to 1971, that's the Ohlone Tribe, and they're connected. Okay, they're connected. They admit that. The reviewers also considered the history leading to the formal creation of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe in 1991. They allowed that the creation of the Muwekma Indian Cultural Association in 1981-82, a nonprofit organization focused on the educational and housing needs of the Ohlone population, and then the creation of the Muwekma's cultural research management firm, Ohlone Families Consulting Services, in 1984, which formed in response to the expanding and profoundly disrespectful treatment of Ohlone remains and ancestral artifacts in a region experiencing immense economic growth. And finally, the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe's formal constitution, comprised of members of a historically continuous Native American people linked to the Ohlone Tribe of 1965-1971 and the Verona Band of 1914 to 1927. That should have done it, right? What a fascinating, paradoxical tableau for fans of suspense and contrived mystery. A Native American people who exist only intermittently in the space-time continuum from 1914 to 1927, from 1965 to 1971, and from 1982 until the present. The final determination, which I requote more fully now, concludes in this vein of time warp fantasies. Quote, because the petitioning group was not identified as an Indian entity for a period of almost 4 decades after 1927, and for only a 6-year period during the 55 years between 1927 and 1982, it has not been identified as an Indian entity on a substantially continuous basis since 1927. 3 massively disruptive fallacies evaporate this fantasy world of intermittently reviving identities and zombie resurrections, apparently deemed credulous in the offices of OFA. The first was established at the beginning of this paper, that the Muwekma petition, having obliged Bar and OFA to admit in 1996 that Muwekma's ancestral tribe, the misnamed Verona Band, was unambiguously recognized. No matter the factual incorrectness of the starting date, only at 1914, Muwekma should no longer have been required to continue along the 25 CFR 83 pathway, which was and remains a corridor only for unrecognized tribes. Moreover, again to reiterate, Indian tribes can only be legally terminated by an act of Congress, which never occurred. Lafayette Dorrington's decision to remove the Verona Band from the list of tribes for whom land should be purchased functioned such that the relationship between the federal government and Muwekma's ancestors could be ignored, but this had no legal status. Secondly, simply as a matter of logical inference, how can a tribe only be who they are intermittently, as the final determination argues? Say if this were applied to an individual, say my daughter, could we accept this? If the government says to me, well, we have your daughter's birth certificates, so we know who she was at birth, and we have her registration in kindergarten 4 years later, so we know who she was then, but we have no data to prove who she was between. What would our reaction be? And then if we were to come back to the government and say, well, look here are photographs showing my daughter with her family during these 4 years. Here's correspondence showing between family members that talk about her during this period. Here's photographs from my synagogue newsletter showing her at a community Seder during those years. And the government, if it were to come back and reply, well, we don't see that data as admissible evidence, what would our reaction be? I believe we would reject such responses and understand that their intent to make parts of our histories, maybe our entire selves, appear to vanish is unacceptable. Because, in fact, the third and equally consequential disruption of the final determination's negative finding is exactly that a mass of evidence does speak directly to the substantial continuity of Muwekma between 1927 until 1965, no less than the body of evidence showing continuous Muwekma history well before 1914. This evidence is amply elaborated in the Muwekma petition. The problem is not a lack of evidence. The problem is OFA's refusal to see that evidence as legible. Well, what then is the evidence? Evidence which, as the FAP regulations mandate, have been identified by reliable external sources on a substantially continuous basis. The voluminous Muwekma petition presents evidence is precisely all about continuities, oddly enough precipitated by the failure of the U.S. Senate following statehood to ratify the 18 treaties that had been negotiated with Indian tribes up and down California. Because the treaties went unratified, the U.S. Congress began a process in 1928 that permitted California Indians to sue the U.S. government for the lands taken from them. And that process required a sequence of enrollments. There were enrollments of individuals, true, but of individuals identified as belonging to tribal entities that existed in the present tense in each enrollment period and as administered under the jurisdiction of the Sacramento Agency of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. These enrollments were reviewed and approved by the BIA. For example, Muwekma ancestors, including the current members' parents and grandparents, enrolled in the Indians of California census rolls authorized under the Act of 1928, approved in 1933 as Mission San Jose Indians. The BIA noted on the enrollment forms that these Mission San Jose Indians had never had land bought from them. In 1944, an initial payment of funds for the lands taken from California Indians was approved, and another round of enrollment occurred in 1955, and again, the parents and grandparents of today's Muwekma members participated and enrolled. Anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, whom you've heard about already, recanted his statements, in part at least, about the extinction of the Ohlone people at the California Indian Claims Commission hearings of 1954 to 1955. And subsequently, the Muwekma's parents and grandparents received a check for $668.51 in the early 1960s, just before they organized as the Ohlone Indian Tribe to protect their ancestors' grave sites at the cemetery at the old San Jose Mission site. What this history shows in bold print is the uninterrupted process by which the descendants of the Verona Band, so-called Verona Band, continue to enroll, like Indians all over California, in federal censuses. These enrollments were approved decade after decade by these federal authorities, substantiating the native tribal entities in the present tense each step of the way. With the Ohlone community, within the Ohlone community, particular individuals, many of whom Alan named and showed, led these efforts, and the tight web of connection, relationship, and community leadership through ritual godparent responsibilities and community commemorations of funerals, births, and multifamily meetings, all of which were occasions where tribal authorities, tribal leaders encouraged their family members to enroll. In addition, because of their approved identification as Native people who were part of a tribal identity, some Ohlone children were eligible to attend Indian residential schools, some of whom did at the Sherman Institute and the Chemawa Indian School. Now, we know that these residential schools were certainly the site of horrendous crimes against Indian children, and we've learned more and more about that in the recent years. Yet the obverse is that the presence of Ohlone children in these schools provides another indisputable piece of evidence for the ongoing, continuous relationship between the federal government and the Ohlone ancestors of Muwekma as a tribal community. So, there is no gap in Muwekma tribal history, not before 1914, not between 1927 and 1965. It would be ludicrous indeed to cast doubt on the direct historical continuity between the people enrolled in the Ohlone Indian Tribe of 1971 and the very same people and their close relatives as they began that process in 1982, which led to the organization of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe. The efforts to render illegible all that substantiates tribal continuity, and thus to appear to make the tribe vanish, are all revealed as specious. All of the data in the Muwekma petition that led to the BIA's admission of the previously unambiguously recognized status also substantiates tribal continuity over all of the decades of the 20th century. The conclusion to this paper and to this analysis is therefore not the negative determination of the petition that was based on specious reasoning, but rather the many ways that, notwithstanding the Herculean work and efforts of the tribe and its allies to assemble the petition for recognition, the federal acknowledgement process has dramatically failed to enact justice for the Muwekma in multiple ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Field, for that information. We don't have a formal Q&A with Dr. Field, but we'll do